Perfect. So thanks so much for joining today. Get all my screens set up here. There we go. All right. My name is Sarah Sarlson, and I am the executive director of the Wyoming Children's Trust Fund and Prevent Child Abuse Wyoming. It is wonderful to see you all. I will let my co-presenter introduce herself.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Nicole Nieder. I'm the Business Office Coordinator with the Children's Trust Fund, and I'm excited to see so many familiar faces and some new faces joining us today.
If you would stick your name in the chat box and where you are tuning in from around Wyoming, it's nice to see where everyone is coming from. So just stick in the chat box what your name is, where you work, where you live. That would be great. Let's go ahead and jump in. Although we recall and describe with words much of what has happened in our lives, the memory of human experience is stored in our bodies and not just in our minds. Today, we're going to talk about the ACEs study, brain development, epigenetics. We're going to share a little bit of Wyoming data. We're going to talk about protective factors and building capacities in adults. And we recognize that this conversation, this information could fill up our entire week. So we are glad you're here to get a little bit of information on a lot of different topics. And thanks so much for being here.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach.
So many of us know what it was that happened for Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris that changed her approach to how she worked with families. Someone walked into her office and handed her a copy of the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. It was developed and co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente of San Diego, California, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Anda, who designed the ACE study while he was working as a senior scientist at the CDC, reviewed and has approved all of the information from the study that I'll report to you today. The original ACE study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997, with 2 waves of data collection. Over 17,000 health maintenance organization members from Southern California receiving physical exams completed confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences and current health status and behaviors. The population surveyed were between the ages of 19 and 94. Most were college educated, and they all had excellent health insurance at the time. This slide shows the 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were studied. The first group are indicators of household dysfunction, which include growing up with a substance abusing household member, alcohol or drugs, parental separation or divorce, growing up with mentally ill household members or caregivers, witnessing intimate partner violence, specifically having a battered mother, or criminal behavior as evidenced by having a household member imprisoned. 3 forms of childhood abuse were studied: emotional, physical, and sexual, and 2 forms of neglect were included: emotional and physical. As you can see from the percentages on the slide, ACEs are common in this middle class, well-educated population. ACEs are also highly interrelated. When there was one ACE in the life of a child, 87% of the time, at least one of the other 9 ACEs also occurred. The fact that the 10 different categories of ACEs tend to cluster called for this new way of looking at how ACEs might affect health and social well-being. This is where the ACE study came from. Because ACEs are so highly interrelated, it didn't make sense to look at how single categories of ACEs influenced health and social problems. Instead, Doctors Onda and Folletti developed the ACE score. This score is simply a count of the number of categories ACEs that each person reported, from 0 to 10. Each category counts as 1 point in the ACE score. So if a person experiences physical abuse, no matter how many times or what the severity of the abuse, the ACE score is 1. If the person experiences physical abuse and has a substance abusing parent, the ACE score is 2, and so forth. So we think of the ACE score as a measure of the childhood biological stress dose. As the ACE score goes up, on average, the exposure to the developmental effects of toxic stress also increases. In this illustration, you see that only a third of the people in the study had an ACE score of 0. 16% had scores of 4 or more. Adverse childhood experiences are common and they tend to cluster. Before we jump too much further into the ACE study, let's talk a little bit about brain development. The human central nervous system, put all those words together, connects us to ourselves, to the people, and to the world around us. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord that integrate all of our senses and information from receptors located throughout the human body. It regulates our internal body functions and manages elaborate chemical and electrical signaling. Cells in the nervous system, as we know, are called neurons. They're stunningly effective at processing and transmitting information, and they have a central purpose in doing so: to adapt in ways that keep us alive. Dr. Martin Teicher of Harvard University reviewed and approved all of the brain science facts that are coming up next. So on the far left, we see a set of brain cells or neurons and what they might look like at the time of birth. There aren't many connections between these cells at birth. Babies are born with only the connections and brain functions they need at that point in life. Most of the wiring of our brains occurs as the result of life experience from our senses. By age 6, those same brain cells now have many connections. The wiring of the brain, or the making of these complex neural networks, is experience dependent. What gets experienced the most tends to lead to more robust connections between nerve cells that form networks. You'll see that in the center here. The last section of the slide represents age 14, about the time of puberty. Notice that there are now fewer connections between the brain cells than there were at age 6. This is because the least experienced connections tend to withdraw at about the time of puberty. This process is called pruning. So this phenomenon helps us to explain why neglect or not getting the experiences that we need can have such a powerful negative impact on health and social functioning. One of those elaborate systems is the limbic system. The brain regions in the limbic system control many things, including physical balance, internal temperature, regulation, and digestion. The limbic system has an important role in the fight or flight response to danger. The hippocampus and amygdala are two regions in the limbic system that are vital for forming healthy relationships. These areas are the most affected areas of the brain from emotional trauma. They can make a trauma survivor fearful, especially with events and situations that remind the survivor of their past trauma. Another brain region with seedling cells is the cerebellar vermis, which connects the two halves of the cerebellum. The vermis is also the part of the brain that regulates the release of our feel-good brain chemistry. The vermis is sensitive to all forms of maltreatment just before puberty, and symptoms may not fully emerge until early adulthood. The vermis may be the seat of mental health. It has a role in virtually every mental illness, including schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and depression. We're only beginning to understand the biological connections between trauma-induced adaptations in the vermis and serious and persistent mental illness. Some brain regions have several periods of sensitivity that span throughout childhood. The corpus callosum is one of them. It's a superhighway that connects the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. Children exposed to various forms of adversity early in life are at increased risk for broad range of developmental difficulties, affecting both cognitive and emotional adjustments. People who report higher ACE scores are more likely to have health and social problems. In fact, as the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health and social problems also goes up. This is that dose-response relationship. You know dose response, the more gas you put in your car, the more miles you can drive. In this case, where there is a higher dose of adverse childhood experiences, the higher the percentage of people with health problems. I'm going to show you a few data slides from the ACE study that are formatted in this same way. Along the bottom horizontal axis are the ACE scores, from 0 on the left to 4 or more on the right. The vertical axis is the percent of people who have the disease or condition. So in the first set of bars on the far left, we see the percent of people who became regular cigarette smokers by age 12 goes up as each level of the ACE score goes up. In the second set of bars, we see the percent of who are smokers as adults. It also goes up in a stepwise fashion as the score goes up, from 0 to 4 or more. People with higher ACE scores have increased risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. About 4% of people with an ACE score of 0 develop COPD, while more than double that percent of people, about 9%, with an ACE score of 4 or more develop COPD. ACEs can lead to the early onset of smoking, which then, if sustained throughout adulthood, eventually leads to a high risk of smoking-related lung disease. So as we begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social conditions, we see the risk of becoming an alcoholic increases sixfold from an ACE score of 0 to a score of 6. And ACEs affect relationships. People with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry an alcoholic. So think for a minute about how these indicate how ACEs tend to be then transmitted from one generation to the next. Depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries. Here we see that the risk of depression increases for both men and women in a dose response fashion as the ACE score goes up. ACEs are held in the body, leading to mental, physical, behavioral health problems into adulthood. Some of those problems are then unintentionally handed to the next generation. Becoming an alcoholic, marrying an alcoholic, and suffering from depression are a part of the intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences. Increasingly, research seems to bear out the fact that the toxic stress of ACEs might not only be experienced by an individual, but could also be transmitted from one generation to the next at a genetic level. So, in very simplified terms, it may be possible to pass on trauma to our children and grandchildren, making the implications of ACEs more devastating and far reaching than we had ever imagined. Some researchers who have studied historic periods of time, like the American Civil War or the Holocaust, now suspect that abuse, neglect, deprivation, and trauma can impair the functioning at some level of future generations who may not even be living in the same adverse circumstances. Epigenetics is the study of the cellular and physiological phenotype trait variation that's caused by either external or environmental factors that switch genes on and off and affect how cells read genes instead of being changed in the DNA sequence. So this means that while the field of genetics looks at the expression of the genetic code, epigenetics studies the factors that influence the expression of those genes. So research in the area of epigenetics has concluded that during early life, the environment we live in can affect the way that our genes are expressed. So environmental factors like security, bonding, and love can alter how our genes switch on and off, or how they simply operate. Differing genetic expressions can occur without causing any changes or mutations to the underlying gene themselves. The environment we experience, especially when we're young, can affect which of our genes are active or expressed and which remain dormant or unexpressed. Epigenetics is this new scientific field that explains how experience gets under our skin. Our genes are contained in the DNA of our cells. Genes provide instructions for cells to become specialized into things like liver cells, heart cells, and so forth. They also contain keys, disease, and well-being through the life course. Epigenetics tells us about the ways that the instructions on our genes are used. So to understand epigenetics, it's important to understand a little bit about how DNA is organized. So think of a long strand of fishing line, many yards of it. In order to fish without the line being tangled or disorganized, the fisherman puts the line on a reel so that the line can be let in or brought back out to stay organized. We have thousands of genes, so our long strands of DNA are tightly condensed into the chromosomes in the nucleus of our cells. So if we look more closely, like the fishing line on the reel, the DNA is tightly wrapped around protein balls called histones. Epigenetics involves the attachment of chemicals, represented by the orange cylinder in the diagram, to the DNA at a particular gene. The attachment of that chemical can prevent the gene's message from being available to be read. Other types of chemical attachments can cause the gene to be open so instructions can be read by the cell. Here is where this is relevant to ACEs. New research suggests that stressful experiences can influence these chemical attachments that influence the reading of our genetic code in ways that can have effects on the way our cells function. This may be an important reason why ACEs are related to so many health and social problems. The hopeful part of this is that other types of positive life experience may affect the reading of our genes that may reverse those negative effects of ACEs or have positive effects on human development, health, and well-being. Our brains are continuously making predictions. When we hear a rustling noise, our brains are predicting whether the noise is a wild animal nearby or just the wind blowing through nearby branches. Our past experiences shape our brain's predictions of current experiences, sights, smells, or the meaning we have made from a similar past experience will affect our expectations. If you have experienced happy days when the sweet smell of cherry blossoms hung in the air in the spring, the smell of cherry blossoms may activate brain predictions of another happy day. But what on that same type of day you had a frightening experience? When you smell cherry blossoms, what would your brain predict would happen next? Amazingly, some of those brain predictions can be passed from generation to generation. In a very fascinating study, Epigenetics conducted laboratory rats to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms. When the cherry blossom odor came into the rats' environment, they huddled together, stunned with fear until the odor was removed. These rats then had pups, babies, who grew up without any exposure to cherry blossoms. This next generation of rats was separated from their parents and placed into a very different environment. When the smell of cherry blossoms was put into the environment of the babies, the rats were jumpy. They had heightened sensitivity to the smell of cherry blossoms. The response to the smell of cherry blossoms had been passed on to the babies by those epigenetic markers. So we think about, why would it be a good thing for sensitivity or fear to be passed from one generation to another through epigenetics? Why might it be a good thing for the rats to feel fear even though no one had instructed them to fear cherry blossoms? It's our survival. Fear can protect a species from dangerous situations or toxins. It may be adaptive for fear to be passed from one generation to the next if it can prevent things like poisoning or avoiding dangers. The field of epigenetics may help us to understand how groups may be deeply affected by historical trauma when the epigenetic responses from our parents or ancestors can be passed on to our future generations. This can happen despite current efforts to care for one another well. How do we heal the wounds of our ancestors? We may not fully know the answer to that question. I think we don't know the answer, but we do know that we are the ones responsible today because we are the adults. No one else is waiting in the wings. So let's think about the positive side of experience being passed down from one generation to the next. Scientists are continuing to study whether positive characteristics like nurturing behavior can be inherited from one parent or grandparents. So the field of epigenetics provides us with hope that our ways of relating to one another can create lasting positive changes in genetic expression. How creating self-healing communities now can lay an enduring path of generational healing and recovery for the future.
So we're going to shift gears just a little bit now and talk about some Wyoming specific data. So in 2020, Wyoming surveyed a sample of adults on their experiences with ACEs before they were the age of 18, and then compared these numbers to 25 other states. As you can see from the graph on the slide, Wyoming scored 19.4% of adults had experienced 4 or more ACEs before the age of 18. That was compared to 15.6% that were surveyed in the other 25 states. The behavioral risk factor surveillance survey, let me start over. This one's a tongue twister for me. The behavioral risk factor surveillance system, or the BRFIS, is the nation's premier system of health-related telephone surveys that collects state data about U.S. residents regarding their health-related risk behaviors, chronic health conditions, and the use of preventative services. The BRFIS was established in 1984 with just 15 states, but it now collects data in all 50 states as well as the District of Columbia and 3 U.S. territories. And if you want to scan the QR code on this slide, it'll take you to the report from the study that we are discussing. So let's take a look at the percentage on this slide. Over half the adults surveyed in the 25 different states have reported experiencing at least one type of ACE. So think about that in terms of the people that you work with, maybe the families that you help, or just those people in your personal lives. ACEs affects people directly and indirectly due to the likelihood of you knowing someone with an ACE score. Among Wyoming adult residents, the highest number of ACEs occurred in those that were ages 18 to 24 years old, those of Native American descent, those with an annual income under $15,000, those without a high school diploma, and those who are unable to work. And those with the higher ACE scores also tended to report higher levels of risk factors such as smoking, obesity, depression, and diabetes. Now, according to the data collected during the 2020 Wyoming BRFIS, information provided by the adults reporting on their mental health, which includes their stress levels, feelings of depression, problems managing their emotions, those reported their mental health was not good 14 or more of the past 30 days. And as you can see on the slide, the risk factors reported are higher among those who have experienced past sexual abuse. Some of the key numbers in Wyoming are that 15% of Wyoming's children under age 5 live in poverty. The Wyoming suicide rate among 15 to 19-year-olds was more than double the US rate for that age group. 31% of women with food insecurities do not know where to go get help with getting food, and 58% of women with financial concerns do not know where to go for financial assistance. So our goal in working with the populations that we help should be to heal the effects of childhood trauma now, so that even the possibility of passing it on to the future generations is minimized. As a community, let's all focus on trying to achieve this goal.
What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies.
By preventing ACEs in children, we can potentially reduce the risk factors when they are adults, such as pulmonary disease, heart disease, obesity, and depressive disorders. So how do we put all this together to make a case for understanding ACEs as a powerful pathway to health and well-being? Now that we understand that ACEs are common, they have a strong cumulative impact on the risk of common health and social problems, preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is the greatest opportunity for improving the well-being of the human populations. In fact, the ACE study team and ACE interface believe that this is the greatest opportunity of our time. So as you can see on this slide, it shows the percentage of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. The calculation that is commonly used to do this in public health studies is called population attributable risk. This is displayed as a percentage on the oil spill on the slide. So the percentage of a problem coded by the oil spill represents the percentage of the problem that is potentially preventable by preventing ACEs. As you can see, the percentages are quite large. And the high percentages on this chart are rarely seen in any other public health study. The cumulative effects of ACEs reflect a powerful opportunity for prevention. No matter if you are working to prevent heart disease or cancer, end homelessness, or improve business profitability, as we align a portion of our work around a common goal of preventing the accumulation of ACEs and moderating their effects, we will reduce all of these problems and many others all at once. The ACE study provides us with straightforward information about the consequences of toxic stress during childhood. This scientific research gives us powerful information we can use every day to improve the health, safety, prosperity, and longevity. But the ACE study isn't a detailed roadmap of services or programs. It's an invitation for all of us to be pioneers. This news is simply too important to wait for somebody else to design a detailed roadmap. Through our collective knowledge and action, we are the ones with the power to shift the dynamics within our own families, our communities, and society that lead to high ACE scores. Our culture has built separate systems and ways of thinking about health and social problems. This way of doing business in society is sometimes called a siloed approach. Each silo has its own budget, training, and mental model about preventing and treating the individual types of problems that is that focus. The ACE study and the knowledge about their effects on brain structure and function now show us that viewing health and social problems as separate issues is an illusion. It's an illusion based on outdated mental models. And now that we know that many common health and social problems have a common cause based upon the powerful impact of ACEs throughout the life course. We used to talk about breaking down silos, but it's not practical because human nature and organizational behavior is such that the budgets and priorities in siloed systems are too well defended. But the good news is that none of us has to stop working on the issues we are passionate about. If we simply add a thread to our work that's focused on preventing the accumulation of ACEs, that common thread will connect and align all of our work in powerful ways. Now, when people hear about the ACE study findings, they often ask about resilience. People get excited about the notion of resilience, in part because it reminds us that our supportive actions really do matter. Our desire for resilience leads naturally to a search for ways to help families and communities. 3 protective systems interact and guide positive adaptation. These powerful systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with caring and competent people, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. Now, what we do know about individuals who do well despite adversity is that the three protective systems are nested. People do best when they are living in thriving families and communities. We can help one another to develop personal attributes that help us all weather life's storms. Personal attributes like a positive view of one's life, self-efficacy, and self-regulation are all discussed at length in the resilience literature. And we're going to briefly just cover the 5 protective factors. So first is parental resilience. This is having the tools to manage stressful situations and the way parents respond to those situations. It's the ability to overcome difficult experiences as well as learn from those experiences and build their own resilience. Social connections is developing positive relationships that in turn can offer and provide a safe space for parents to discuss difficult situations or a parenting strategy, and to have a positive relationship so parents know they are not alone. The knowledge of parenting and child development is parents understanding their child's development and having realistic expectations of what their child is capable of at that level. This is also beneficial for parents understanding their role in their own child's physical, cognitive, language, and social or emotional development. Concrete support in times of need is having access to concrete supports or services that address the family's needs as well as reducing their stress. It's important as some families don't even know what's available or understand what they need to ask for. Some families just don't know what they're missing or what they could be in need of. And lastly, social and emotional competence of children is family and child interactions that help children to develop the ability to communicate clearly, recognize and regulate their emotions, and establish and maintain relationships. We can add to the positive side of the resilience scale by piling on positive experiences, especially through responsive relationships. The one thing that most children who develop resilience have in common is a stable, committed relationship with a supportive parent, a caregiver, or another adult in their lives. And don't forget that adults also need supportive relationships also. So during a crisis like the COVID-19 outbreak, families needed their immediate basic needs met before they could focus on anything else. But when the crisis was over, longer-term programs that support adults and children in building and practicing their core skills would still be needed long-term. This can be applied to families' needs outside of a pandemic as well. Now, when we talk about culture, it can be an umbrella term that encompasses the collective social behavior, institutions, and the norms found in human societies, which include the collective knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and the habits of the individuals in these groups. But as you can see on this slide, the tip of the iceberg or the surface culture are the things that we can see can be very few compared to the deep culture that we all have as individuals. And as we consider each protective factor, we will have you consider a few questions. So first, how does culture impact families as they seek to build protective factors? How does your own culture shape how you feel, how you think, how you behave? And how do the differences in culture impact helping others to build protective factors? Cultural safety is the ultimate goal when working with families, so they feel seen and heard. To achieve this goal, we first need to be culturally aware. Understanding the difference between your own culture and those that have a different culture from your own, it's important to remember the differences in the attitudes and values. Be culturally sensitive by being aware of these cultural differences and not judging those with a different culture. Educate yourself and your understanding of cultural trauma. As seen on the previous slide, what may show on the surface in today's world can just be the tip of the iceberg to a culture. But culture goes back many generations, and things that have happened historically can that have been traumatic can evolve over time to become cultural today. And lastly, commit to self-evaluation. Be aware of and understand the power imbalances that are present in the work you do. Using these 3 strategies will create a culturally safe environment for families where they are free to express their own cultures, as well as feeling seen and heard, that in turn will create a safe space for children and families. And like any culture, it's impossible to fully understand unless you live in that culture with all the differences and experience all the finer details. And it's okay to admit that you don't know everything. It's about respecting those around you. Now, there is a predictable pattern to transformative change. It begins with discovery and communication, which leads people to clarify their values and thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the actions they take in everyday life. The collective actions of many people shape a new reality that's ratified in organizational and policy change. The truth is that people create a new reality long before new laws are passed. The change is up to us. It's shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, the way we relate with one another in our relationships, in families, and in our communities. And as we work to prevent the accumulation of ACEs, let's keep in mind that we don't have to get ACE scores to 0. Bringing the scores down any amount will have huge effects on future generations. We might not be able to prevent a first ACE from occurring in a family, but we certainly can notice when children have 5 ACEs and make sure that number doesn't go to 10. And as we thread through all of our work, a new focus of supporting adults, particularly adults who through no fault of their own have experienced many ACEs when they were children, we will prevent ACEs for the next generation. We live at a time of great hope and promise. The largest public health discovery of our time is about family, community, children. It's about us. Our action to prevent ACEs, whether large or small, can profoundly improve our future.
We have a beautiful little boy named Bronson. I have no idea how we got so lucky, but he's just such an awesome little dude. We're actually excited to be parenting him different than how we were kind of raised growing up in certain capacities. Growing up, my dad, he just wanted to work on the railroad and then come home and drink every day. I wanted to hang out with him a bunch, but it always seemed like it was taking away from his time to drink.
When my mom was pregnant with me, my dad was like pushing 50 and decided to stop drinking. And prior to that, he was, a chronic, alcoholic. And so I grew up in a sober house, but with parents who didn't talk about it. I didn't know how to have a healthy relationship with alcohol or with anything because it was really presented to me like anybody who drinks regularly has a problem.
I went to treatment the first time in 2017, relapsed in like 3 or 4 weeks after I got out.
So he went to rehab again a year later. And during that period of time, I did a ton of reading and researching. And it changed my whole career. I ended up working in substance abuse and mental health treatment.
I knew 100% that she was in my corner.
And so embarking on the learning process together kept us on the same page with the same vocabulary. So it wasn't until, we were in our healthy, balanced life that we were ready to have kids.
And with our son, it just, anything that he does, I want to support him. I don't care what it is. Basically reinforcing that support that I didn't have.
Your parents can have done the best that they could, But that doesn't mean they didn't traumatize you, but like we have to be honest about these things to stop repeating them.
That concludes our presentation for today. If you wouldn't mind completing the survey that Sarah dropped into the chat, it helps us get feedback on how we did, what you liked, what you'd like to see more of. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your week.